Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. I'm Georgina Downer and I'm the host of Afternoon Light and the CEO of the Robert Menzies Institute. The Institute is a prime ministerial library and museum devoted to upholding the legacy and vision of Sir Robert Menzies, Australia's longest serving Prime Minister. On Afternoon Light, we explore contemporary issues relevant to Sir Robert's life and legacy with leading thinkers from around the world. Thank you for joining us today. Hello, and on today's episode of the Afternoon Light podcast, I'm talking to Dr. William Stoltz, who is the Robert Menzies Institute's first ever visiting fellow, and he's also a senior advisor for public policy at the National Security College at the Australian National University. He has a PhD, an advanced Masters of National Security Policy, all from the ANU, but he did start off his academic career here at Melbourne University doing the fabulous Bachelor of Arts. Welcome to the Afternoon Light podcast, Will.
Thanks, Georgina. I really appreciate being back here in the old quad. It's kind of like walking through deja vu to be back around here, but it's a beautiful spot and it's great to be recording with you in person.
It is a really, really lovely spot. We are so grateful every day walking around here thinking, wow, this is our home. Today we are talking about the research you've been doing for the Robert Menzies Institute, which is on the history of ASIS, the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, and it celebrates its 70th anniversary imminently in a week's time.
13th of May, yeah.
So tell me, Will, let's start this conversation off at the very beginning. I think two oldest professions in the world are prostitution and espionage and spies. So tell me about the history of spying.
Yeah, and not the other profession, no.
No. I'll save that for another podcast and probably another guest.
Well, I mean, it's such a big history, and as you say, different cultures and civilizations have used spies and have engaged in espionage kind of since time immemorial. When we think about it in the Australian context, though, we very much derive, I suppose, our tradition of these institutions from the British tradition, and the British tradition of espionage is a very old one and a very storied one. I mean, when we think about what is typically referred to as secret services, these agencies or organisations that are there to engage in foreign spying and what is typically called covert action overseas. We can go back to Elizabeth I and the Secret Service operated by her Secretary of State, Sir Francis Walsingham. So, you know, during her reign, it was obviously a tumultuous period for British history or English history. And she very much leaned heavily on the Secret Service of Sir Francis Walsingham to prop up her power, to head off assassination attempts, and to support her foreign wars and foreign engagements. And there's many things about that original Secret Service, or one of those original Secret Services, that is still kind of in the continuity in the DNA of organisations today. You know, even though the structure of government has changed quite a lot around that British tradition, secret services still are first and foremost answerable to, you know, the executive heads of state and leaders of the country. They still have that purpose of engaging in foreign spying and covert action or secretly shaping events overseas. And they still operate with special immunities and privileges to undertake these things that really only the most highest ranking members of the government of the day can give them permission to do. So there's kind of this ancient lineage, I suppose, to what is in some ways a very modern organisation. But that's the lineage that I suppose ASIS, MI6, and even organisations like the CIA and other kind of comparable agencies across the Commonwealth kind of have their lineage too, yeah.
And how did we get to having an Australian Secret Service?
Well, Australia developed its Secret Service, I suppose, significantly later than Britain. So the one that most of your listeners are probably familiar with is the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. So that was founded, I think, in 1909, so just before the First World War. And Australia doesn't create its Secret Intelligence Service until 1952, so significantly later. that said, Australia was engaging in espionage before then. So even before Federation, Australia's state governments were leveraging expatriates and commercial agents operating specifically in Pacific parts of the region to understand what the French and other European powers were doing near Australia's borders.
You often hear stories, those Graham Greene novels of someone was working in import-export, but they were actually, that was their cover, obviously, for working as a secret intelligence operative.
Yeah, and honestly, in those early days of Australian espionage, just before the First World War, it was very much that. It was commercial agents and businessmen who were working for Australian firms in the region who they had a commercial interest, but I suppose also a sense of national interest in the intervention of the French and other powers in parts of the world that were important for Australia's economic and security prosperity. So they kind of volunteered information to the Australian government, and you'd have premiers and prime ministers later who would actively kind of seek them out to provide information. So it happened in that very kind of ad hoc way.
So they weren't necessarily being paid, these people. They were undertaking legitimate business activities, but on the side as loyal expatriates were providing a bit of information.
Yeah. It was I suppose fairly informal in that way, and it becomes more formalised. Obviously throughout the Great War, the First World War, Australia does contribute to the intelligence effort of Britain and the Allies, but that's through the military first and foremost. And then into the 1920s, you have significant Australian figures who become, I suppose, much more plugged into the British intelligence community. So you have Richard Casey, who's dispatched by Stanley Bruce to be Australia's representative in London. And Richard Casey is embedded into the British Foreign Office and the Cabinet Office and works incredibly closely, actually, with the British Secret Intelligence Service and the senior public servants responsible for that organisation. And so he sees firsthand, I suppose, the value that secret intelligence can provide to policymakers in the British system. And he also gets a bit of a glimpse of what the British government is able to do in terms of what he refers to as black arts, covert action and these sorts of activities.
And for our listeners, we just should let them know that Richard Casey subsequently becomes a very notable external affairs minister in the Menzies government, among other portfolios, of course. And to this day, the building that the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade occupies in Canberra is called the R.G. Casey Building. So, long-term commemoration of his contribution.
Yeah, I mean, he was a remarkable Australian, and this is one of the fascinating things when you do look at Menzies' cabinet, is that he was really having to herd a group of very big egos and very big personalities, people who were incredible statesmen in their own right.
True.
And Casey does go on to be quite seminal in leading in the creation of the Australian Secret Intelligence Service when he, both I suppose when he becomes federal director of the Liberal Party in the late 1940s, but then also as a cabinet minister after that 1949 election.
But another key figure, of course, in the creation of ASIS is Alfred Deakin Brooks, isn't it? And he's a real upstart, isn't he? He's in his 20s, coming up with this idea, pushing it with Richard Casey. Tell me about this. And this was outside of government too.
Yeah, so
it's fascinating.
Alfred Brooks is a really fascinating character. So he was Alfred Deakin's grandson, the second Prime Minister, and Alfred Brooks served in throughout the Second World War, mostly as an intelligence officer, and he worked for what was called the Allied Intelligence Bureau, which was a joint intelligence organisation pooling the intelligence resources of the Australians, the British, Americans and the Dutch, operating predominantly in what is today Indonesia, Papua New Guinea and East Timor. So in those areas that were occupied by Japan. So he had a great deal of exposure to sabotage and propaganda missions in particular, operating behind enemy lines. So that's where he got a real taste for special operations, as it was called then. And because of his exposure to that part of the world, immediately after the war, he went and worked on the staff of H.V. Evatt, who was External Affairs Minister for Chifley, and worked quite closely in the efforts by the Australian government and the UN to establish an independent Indonesia. And during that time, he suggested to H.V. Evatt that Australia should have a secret service, a secret intelligence service. H.V. Evatt, who was perennially kind of suspicious of British intelligence men, didn't want a bar of it. Brooks, after that career experience, returns to Melbourne and reaches out to Richard Casey, who's Federal Director of the Liberal Party, and is employed by the Liberal Party as a special advisor for foreign affairs and subversive activities, which is a really weird job description for a party staffer to have.
Yeah, and we're not just talking about a party. I mean, this was a party that had just been born.
Yeah, yeah.
Only created in 1944. So you're talking about, what, 48?
He starts working for... So Alfred Deakin Brooks starts working for Casey in 1947.
47,
and
right.
I think leaves the employ of the Liberal Party in 1949, I think,
right.
just before the election. So
Okay.
he's working for the party for a while. I think he works as a journalist at the same time and has a couple of other business interests. But he's beginning this conversation with Richard Casey and with Robert Menzies about the need for an Australian Secret Service even before they are in government, which is quite weird to have a political party, thinking so deeply about these types of initiatives that they'll take into government. Now, whether Richard Casey and Menzies had specifically decided that they would undertake to create this agency before they were elected is a little bit unclear.
Right.
But it's certainly clear from the documentary evidence that immediately once Menzies is elected, Brooks really steps up the vigour with which he's lobbying for the creation of ASIS, and it moves very quickly. So Richard Casey, Menzies, Percy Spender, and Philip McBride, who's a defence minister, they meet in early 1950. So really only a couple of months after the Menzies government is elected, they're meeting to figure out what ASIS will look like. And they're doing this at the same time that the bill to ban the Communist Party is happening. So the decision to create ASIS is really part of this larger national security agenda that the Menzies government comes into power with, which is very focused on, anti-communist initiatives, but it is really focused on bolstering Australia's preparedness for a much more hostile world. These men, they seriously do believe that there is a possibility of a third world war, and they think they need to prepare Australia for that. So that's kind of the context that you need to have when looking at this.
Yeah. But as you say, it was very unusual. I mean, looking back now, to think that it was a political party that was driving this change rather than a decision of government to implement some sort of dramatic organisational change in the way Australia did business overseas or conducted itself overseas. But that said, it didn't exist in Australia in that formal sense, so the idea had to come from somewhere. But tell me, so the origins of ASIS in terms of an idea are coming out of the brand new Liberal Party in the late 1940s, and then Menzies' government is elected in 49 and off it goes. Does that politicise ASIS then because of its origin story?
Yeah, look, I think in a way it does, because the Labor Party under Chifley had a very rocky and really quite bad relationship with the British and the American intelligence communities because of the 1940s, when there had been detected Soviet infiltration of the Australian bureaucracy. And as I said, Evatt was very suspicious of these types of agencies. I don't think he was particularly trusting that they always really had Australia's best interests at heart because of the experiences during the Second World War and the First World War as well. So as a result, I think there's already this sense from the Labor side of politics that the people that populate intelligence agencies in the British system, and then subsequently through organisations like ASIO and ASIS, they are very much of the patrician class. These are people they've gone to the right schools, they're often not recruited through any formal process, they're kind of just referred to, they're members of the right clubs and those sorts of things. And
there's stories of MI6 going to Oxford and Cambridge and just picking out suitable looking undergraduates and tapping them on the shoulder, having a quiet word, and off they go after they graduate to join the Secret Service. Yeah,
and that's not too dissimilar how that recruitment happens in Australia. You've got a lot of former military officers, and it's very much the officer class who are coming out of intelligence roles in the Second World War, who are members of the Melbourne Club and these sorts of organisations, they are part of that immediate circle of people who are pulled into these quite small intelligence services as they start off, so particularly ASIO and ASIS. And I think that does set up this kind of cultural mismatch or bifurcation from the very beginning for these agencies. Now, obviously, today we have very strong principles of bipartisanship, and the agencies employ a rich diversity of people. And I don't think anyone would accuse any of our intelligence services in Australia today of having kind of any political affinities in that regard. But back then, yeah, it was very much a different story.
Yeah, it's interesting too to then reflect on how ASIS and ASIO had their concerns about the Labor side of politics too, and its connections to communist activities in Australia. So you wonder, was it just a backlash from how Australia was treated in World War II and the disappointment Evatt had in that, or was it that they were worried about what might be uncovered and uncomfortable truths?
Yeah, and I think it's worth remembering in that context that the relationship of the Labor Party with the Communist Party of Australia and their outlook on the Cold War generally in the 1940s was very different to how it ended up being a decade or so later. In the immediate early years of the Cold War, Chifley is sceptical about this framing of Russia as being an enemy. His view was, well, this was one of our great allies during the Second World War. We couldn't have won the Second World War without Russia.
Yeah.
And so for him and for Evatt to see this kind of rapid and quite jarring shift to cast Russia and the Soviet Union as being this great enemy, I think they felt that was a bit of an overreach, and they hoped that there could be a different global order. And so I think that was part of it, was that these men were somewhat slow to come to that view that what the Soviet Union was engaging with around the world needed to be treated quite seriously, because it was hostile. And you see that in the engagement that they have with MI6 and the CIA when this infiltration of external affairs and defence happens, is that Chifley and Evatt are both quite, I think they're quite resistant to take it as seriously as MI6 and CIA wanted them to. So when they are being presented with the evidence that external affairs and defence have been infiltrated, you have Chifley kind of casting, he's a bit sceptical about if it's really as serious as the agencies are making out. And then you also have Evatt being very resistant to the demands that Australia create ASIO, our domestic security agency. And it's really not until MI6 and CIA say Australia will be cut off from top secret information unless you do this. It's really that threat that generates the creation of ASIO. And as a result, you actually have, in recently declassified correspondence, you have MI6 and CIA officers actually expressing a desire, a hope that the Liberal Party will come to power in 1949 because they believe that the Menzies government will be easier to deal with.
Yeah, well, don't they say that Menzies is the more favoured partner in their analysis of the situation in Australia? And so again, that sense that ASIS is quite politicised from its origins, but also when you talk about that sort of early 50s period, there presumably on the part of Chifley and then Evatt was this scepticism that if you're uncovering links between international communism and people in the Department of External Affairs, Department of Defence, that they potentially were just people who had left-wing views, or were they genuinely partnered with international communism? Is this a partisan? Is ASIS and security services, are they part of a partisan play about getting rid of Labor-aligned people, left-wing aligned people out of the public service, or is it genuine security threats facing Australia?
Yeah. That's definitely the suspicion that Labor has around ASIO, but it's worth remembering that ASIS is not actually it's kept secret from Parliament and therefore from the Labor Party for quite a while.
Do you think it was though? Do you think that the Labor Party genuinely didn't know for years that it didn't exist?
So, especially for those first couple of years. So, when it's being considered in 1950, 1951, when it's created in 1952, and it goes through a little bit of a reorganisation in 1954, certainly through that period, the opposition is not aware. I think they are briefed towards the end of the 50s, and at that point I think it is only the opposition leader and one or two other senior members of the Labor Party that are briefed. Certainly Parliament writ large doesn't know about it. So ASIS is created by an executive order, really from the Governor-General, but obviously at Menzies' advice, on the 13th of May 1952. And the reason that Menzies has created it that way is to keep it secret from Parliament, because the other alternative, which some members of his cabinet were pushing for, was that it be legislated from the very beginning to give it that parliamentary mandate to exist. But Menzies was of the view that Parliament didn't need to know, that this was an agency to support, the cabinet. It was an executive agency, and that its work was so sensitive that Parliament shouldn't be briefed on it.
It's interesting Menzies took that view, given he was such a devotee of the sovereignty, the ultimate sovereignty of Parliament, that it was the politicians were there to serve the people, and they did that through the vehicle of Parliament, and the utmost respect must be given to Parliament, due process, that it is a forum for debate and discussion, but also that things should be done by the book, by the rule of law. So how do you think, on reflection, that creating ASIS through an executive order, subverting the oversight of Parliament, and then I think the budget funding for ASIS was actually hidden within the Department of Defence's budget, so you didn't even have parliamentary oversight over how to fund our Secret Service. I mean, how do you reconcile respect for the sovereignty of Parliament with the way ASIS was created?
Well, I think it's quite right. Menzies was a devotee of Parliament. He was a real parliamentarian in the truest sense.
Yes.
But I think he was also someone that really understood and had quite a strong conviction for what the role of cabinet should be and what cabinet authority should be, and what the I suppose entitlements of the executive was. And I think he regarded national security and particularly defence issues as something that resided very much in the purview of the executive, so him as the Prime Minister and his cabinet. And so I think he just felt that it was, in his view of the Westminster system, these were things that should naturally reside with the imprimatur and the decision-making of the executive, and that again is kind of aligned to this British tradition that these special organisations, they are serving the executive leadership of the country. They're not serving the Parliament. So I think that was kind of how he reconciled it, because he was very firm on how he operated cabinet. He did really want cabinet solidarity on a lot of the decisions that he'd make, but at the same time, he was also mindful of the fact that he was first among equals. He was the chief executive officer, so to speak.
Was there precedent for the executive order establishing ASIS in the UK context?
I'm not sure off the top of my head, actually. Yeah, I mean, that is obviously a different system because they weren't going through a Governor-General. But and as I say, their intelligence services kind of have a much longer lineage and relationship with the royals. I would actually recommend, for those listeners interested, there's a brilliant book by Rory Cormack, I think it's called The Secret Royals, which details the relationship of the royal family with the intelligence services that goes back all the way to Queen Elizabeth. It's a fascinating read.
Oh, it would be. Yeah. So we've got ASIS in 1952 created, the first Director General, Alfred Brooks. Tell me how it evolved.
So it starts off quite small in those first years and leans very heavily on support from MI6. And its operations are particularly focused on Australia's immediate region. And I suppose it's worth remembering that in the context in which it's created, Australia has the Malayan emergency happening up up north. The Korean War is evolving. And there's also still a lot of speculation about what trajectory Japan is going to take, because Japan is still reconstructing after the Second World War, and its politics is very volatile. And so I suppose these are the geopolitical focuses that generate the creation of ASIS. And Menzies and his ministers very much conceive of ASIS as not just being an agency to support Australia's national interests and security needs, but to be supporting the British system writ large. It really is what I would call an empire agency. They, after the Second World War, are really hoping to bed down British power in the Asia Pacific. You know, obviously Britain's global role takes a bit of a battering during the Second World War, and you see a bit of a pullback of British power in the Asia Pacific. And the Australian government under Menzies is trying to find ways to keep Britain invested in this region, but also making sure that Australia has a high degree of leverage over the decisions that are made about the future of this region. And so setting up an intelligence service that is supporting the role of MI6 and other friendly agencies is part of Australia actually contributing, making kind of meaningful intelligence contributions that can be leveraged by the rest of their allies and partners. So that's really the context in those early years. Obviously, after you have the creation of the ANZUS Pact, and about a decade later or so when you have Britain's withdrawal east of Suez, the role of ASIS pivots much more to supporting the CIA and American agencies in the region. But in those initial years, it's very much focused on supporting Britain.
Yeah, that's interesting. And were ASIS agents, where were they operating out of in that context around our near region?
So ASIS's first stations, as they were referred to, were in Tokyo, Jakarta and Bangkok. And there's a couple of others that are added over the years, again in Southeast Asia. But they're also operating out of British missions as well in those countries. So you have this, particularly in those early years, you have this strange dynamic happening where you have ASIS officers operating with diplomatic cover out of Australian missions, but then you also have ASIS officers operating under British diplomatic cover out of British missions and being answerable to MI6.
Isn't it a bit obvious though? Aren't their accents a bit different?
I would have thought, yeah. But again, this goes to where you're recruiting people from. If you're getting people from the right suburbs of Melbourne and Sydney, they probably sound, and maybe parts of Adelaide, they probably do sound quite British.
Indeed. But that's really interesting. So despite the fact that we've signed ANZUS in 51, that Australia is looking much more to the United States as its great and powerful friend, particularly after the experience during the Second World War and the British withdrawing from Singapore and the fall of Singapore and all those experiences that Australia have had, the disappointment with Britain really leaving it feeling quite abandoned. Australia is still, through this new Secret Service, working to preserve British power in our region, despite the let's be honest, the evidence that it's diminishing pretty fast, especially with the decline of empire and then you have the emergence of the Commonwealth.
Yeah, but I suppose it's worth remembering that to men like Casey and Menzies, who are they are quite Anglo-Australian, it perhaps wasn't as obvious to them.
No.
When they're looking at a map of Australia's region, there's a lot of Union Jacks. There's a lot of parts of that near region that aren't yet, they're still colonies and settlements of Britain.
And these events don't happen overnight either.
No.
These are slowly developing trends, and
And America's commitment to the region is still in the early 50s is still a bit of a coin toss. You obviously you see a significant military commitment to the Korean War, and while that's a very worrying international crisis, that is a very reassuring thing to the Australian government to see America committing in that way. But the long-term staying power of America in the region is kind of still up for debate in the early 50s, because it's worth remembering that prior to the Second World War, the only real permanent American presence in the region is in the Philippines. Beyond that, they're not really in our neighbourhood.
No, I guess in Japan as well, further north. But that's true. It was, as you say, it was a coin toss whether the US would stay actively engaged in the Eastern Pacific, the South Pacific, or whether they would go back to their, traditional isolationist approach.
Yeah,
which,
their Monroe Doctrine.
had in the past served them, as they, in their eyes at least, pretty well. So tell me, Alfred Brooks is leading this new secret service. It's operating out of Jakarta and Tokyo. And how does he work with other departments and agencies? Because it's not straightforward, and anything new in the public service is going to ruffle feathers. I mean, you and I have both been in the public service, so anything new is challenging. And he has a particular style, doesn't he? He's used to working with the top, and he doesn't necessarily bother with the usual protocols and processes of a bureaucracy. And this is a small bureaucracy in those days, much smaller than it is today.
Oh yeah, no, it's a very tight-knit elite group of people. And you're right, Alfred Brooks, I mean, he's incredibly young when he's 32 when he's made Director General. It's absurd, really. Yeah. And he has a very deep personal friendship with Richard Casey, and he's quite friendly with Robert Menzies as well. And so he leans very heavily on those personal relationships, both to get ASIS set up, but then in those early years of operating it. And that immediately causes tensions with the heads of the External Affairs and Defence Department in particular, who... these are secretaries. They are technically more senior than him as an agency head, and yet he's going round them. He's going straight to Menzies. He's going straight to Casey and other ministers. And
ASIS is reporting to the Prime Minister's department then at this stage? So
initially it is under the Defence Department, but he reports to a subcommittee of Cabinet, which comprises the Prime Minister, External Affairs Minister and the Defence Minister. And that causes tensions because even though ASIS is funded by the defence budget and it's within the Defence Department, it's using diplomatic cover in missions operated by External Affairs. So there's a whole lot of messy aspects to its structure in those early years, and it starts off in defence, then it goes under External Affairs. But these tensions with Brooks and Arthur Tang in particular,
he's Secretary of External Affairs.
He's the Deputy Secretary of External Affairs, but he opposes ASIS from the beginning, as does the Secretary Alan Watt. And the Secretary of Defence. So there's these very large personalities, these huge mandarins of the public service, are not on board with ASIS's structure from the very beginning. And then Alfred Deakin Brooks's personality they find particularly grating. And the real straw that breaks the camel's back, though, is in 1957, I think, when Brooks goes to DC, to Washington, and meets with Secretary of State John Foster Dulles and his brother, the CIA director, Alan Dulles, without consulting External Affairs and Defence, which anyone who's listening to this who might be an agency head today, I think they would be shuddering at the thought of behaving in such a unilateral way.
And why did he not consult them? He just thought they would try and stop him?
Well, this is a little unclear. So what we know is that one of the things he discussed with them was the prospect of America basing long-range nuclear missiles in Australia. So a very, very sensitive proposition. And it's quite possible that Richard Casey sent Brooks over to talk about this matter and deliberately didn't want other people in the bureaucracy to know about it. And this type of this is referred to today as intelligence diplomacy. So this does happen where agency heads in intelligence agencies are leveraged by the government of the day to undertake kind of sensitive diplomatic missions. But the idea that you would do it without consulting at all the head of your foreign service and the head of your...
Well, particularly the head of defence.
Yeah.
If you're talking about nuclear missiles, surely that would have maybe had some relevance to the defence portfolio.
Yeah. And so after Defence and External Affairs learn of this, they disregard that as just an act of roguishness that really can't be...
A bridge too far.
It is a bridge too far. And after that happens, there is a really concerted move to abolish ASIS. So, and Richard Casey, who had been a really strong proponent of the Secret Service for so long, actually starts to waver. So Alfred Brooks says much later that he felt that Casey, after becoming External Affairs Minister, suddenly became very nervous and paranoid about the fact that he was responsible for these intelligence officers.
Had he gone a bit native? He'd sort of fallen into the clutches of the Department of External Affairs, and they had, do you think, worn him down?
Potentially, I think that was potentially part of it, but I think it may have also been the fact that Casey was, I think Casey always had in the back of his mind that he might be able to be Prime Minister one day. You know, he and Menzies had an interesting kind of competition and rivalry there. I think they respected each other deeply, but there was a bit of a rivalry because Casey was a huge personality and a brilliant politician in and of himself. And I think Casey felt that as External Affairs Minister responsible for these spies operating overseas with diplomatic cover, he suddenly became concerned that if they were exposed and there was a diplomatic incident, that he would be fired, that it would be the end of his career. And so there is this quite sharp shift in Casey's support for ASIS. And so you have this extraordinary meeting in 1957 where Menzies isn't present. So Menzies is recovering from surgery, and there's this cabinet meeting where they agree to abolish ASIS. At the advice of the heads of defence and external affairs.
That's extraordinary.
Which is quite, and it's not, no one in the documentary evidence I've read, no one explicitly says we did this meeting while Robert Menzies was under the knife because we knew that if he was there, he wouldn't back it. But the timing is interesting. The idea that you would take such an extraordinary proposal to cabinet and have the Prime Minister not there is pretty unusual. And essentially what happens after this decision is made is a flurry of activity in Canberra, London and Washington to save ASIS. So in Canberra, you have Charles Spry, who's the head of ASIO and a good friend of Brooks. He's aware of all the pain and difficulty that happened in the 1940s to get ASIO set up. And he's immediately advocating to save ASIS, and he advises on a whole lot of structural changes to its operations, but also concedes that Brooks probably has to leave as Director General. So he's advocating for ASIS in Canberra. In Washington, you have Percy Spender, who's now, at this point in time, he's the ambassador to the US. He's prevailed upon by the State Department, who advised that they have grave concern over the prospect of ASIS being abolished. And then you have the CIA directly lobbying Casey. So they're going out and visiting Casey at his farm and really putting the hard word on Casey to save ASIS. And then you also have the deputy head of MI6 come out to Canberra. So he does a blitz of the public service in Canberra, and again he lobbies Casey directly to save ASIS. And the message from the CIA and MI6 is the same message that they delivered to Shifley and Evatt in the 40s over ASIO, which was, if you get rid of this agency, you will lose access to top secret information. That, you know, you're out of the family, essentially. And it's that proposition which really brings Menzies back to the cabinet. Now he's recovered, goes back to the cabinet and says, we're not doing this. No. We will keep ASIS, but it will be under a different leadership and with structural changes. And he ends up issuing a new charter for the agency that kind of clarifies its role a bit more. But that's it for Brooks. That's the end of his time as head of ASIS, and he goes on to a new and interesting career doing other things. But
completely outside of government.
Yeah.
Mm. Do you see then that ASIS had sort of two lives? So it had that first 7 years or so, and then after that a kind of completely different iteration. Was it a very different agency after that initial existential drama?
Well, it's interesting. ASIS has several of these existential moments throughout its history.
Yeah.
So there's actually 3 Director Generals of ASIS who were fired. So, which is pretty unusual, pretty bad track record actually for a government agency. So it has multiple run-ins, but throughout the Menzies era, it becomes much more stable after Brooks leaves. And it's worth remembering that all this tumult around Brooks's leadership is really in the first early years of ASIS. So there's a lot of teething issues about, as I mentioned, which department does it sit under, how does it fund its funding work, how is it responsible to cabinet, because it's quite an unusual agency. So it does take a couple of years to actually figure out how to run this properly. And Australia has its own kind of unique Westminster system that requires it, a few alterations and a trial and error, I suppose, to figure out how an agency like this works.
Of course.
But under the remainder of the Menzies government, it still retains this what I call the kind of two hidden hands. One for stealing secrets, so espionage, and one for shaping events, covert action. It still has at its core these two functions throughout the Cold War. So, there's historians kind of speculate and debate around ASIS's involvement in affairs in Indonesia, particularly things like confrontasi and the civil strife in Indonesia in the 60s. There's a lot of speculation about, well, not all speculation, good academic study about ASIS's role in the Vietnam War and these sorts of things. So it plays an active role throughout the Cold War, but certainly ASIS has its kind of next existential crisis when you do have a change of government, and you have Whitlam come to power in the 70s. Whitlam is briefed on ASIS prior to coming to power, but
ASIS is still a secret organisation from
Yeah.
public.
Yeah.
So it would have come as he probably had a good idea that it existed by that stage, you'd say. But
it's interesting, there was stories that when Billy McMahon became Prime Minister, he was convinced there was multiple ASISes. Because it had so many euphemisms, there were so many different names for referring to the agency, and he was so kind of suspicious of these spooks that he was convinced that someone was keeping an agency secret from him.
Oh, right. But they weren't.
No.
So Whitlam comes in 72. It's the first time there's been a Labor government in Australia since 1949. So, that's a generation of Liberal governments. And for the public service, that's a big change too, dealing with the different side of politics. And that is another existential moment for ASIS where it has to justify itself and potentially change direction. Yeah,
so there's two tensions immediately with Whitlam. So there was the fact that there's a difficult relationship with Indonesia in the 70s, and Whitlam is very concerned about ASIS's operations in Timor, and he gives the instruction to, I think it's Bill Robinson is the Director General at the time, that ASIS is not to have intelligence officers on the ground in Timor. He doesn't want, I think the phrase is, he doesn't want Australian spies on the ground. And ASIS kind of take a very technical interpretation of what that means. And so they don't have Australians on the ground, but they continue to use agents. They have locals who they engage as intelligence sources on the ground. Yeah. And when Whitlam finds this out, he regards that as a complete, they've completely disregarded his instructions. So that is the big frustration for Whitlam. But the other one is that you have in Chile at the time, the CIA are running operations against the Allende government, and the CIA are evicted from Chile at the time, and they hand over their intelligence sources, their agents, to ASIS at the time. And when Whitlam gets wind of this, he's just like, why on earth are you operating in Chile? He doesn't regard that as an activity that ASIS should be doing, and he instructs them to cease that activity, and it takes a little while for those for that station to be closed down, and he feels that it they're
shuffling their feet a bit.
Yeah, they're shuffling his feet, and they're shuffling their feet, and the instructions weren't followed properly. So he sacks Bill Robertson on the spot. There's, the stories that he had a shouting match with him and just sacked him on the spot. So that's the second kind of existential moment for ASIS then under Whitlam. And Whitlam really does pull back ASIS's covert action function at that time. He says the espionage function can continue, but this function of engaging in special operations overseas, the only contingency in which ASIS can undertake that activity is wartime. He essentially says you can maintain a kind of a residual kind of auxiliary, preparatory kind of capability for that, but it's only really in case we actually end up at war, in a wartime context, that's to be used.
And it takes about another 10 or so years for ASIS's functions to sort of be rehabilitated to what they were pre-Whitlam, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting. The Labor government under, jumping forward, under Hawke, gives them a little bit more scope. But Gareth Evans makes some remarks in Parliament where, again, he kind of rules out what is referred to as political action. So he rules out ASIS engaging in political interference. So that's kind of stays the posture for quite a while. And it's really not until...
And what's the basis of that, do you know? Why does Gareth Evans take that view?
Well, I think that there's at that period of time, you're in the later stages of the Cold War, and there's a perception that, Australia is aspiring to this kind of constructive internationalism and wanting to be a good global citizen, that it's really not appropriate that Australia be... maintaining a capability to engage in the politics of other countries. I think that's the view that the Hawke government takes at that time. And obviously by that point in time, ASIS is publicly acknowledged. So in 1977, Fraser does tell Parliament that ASIS exists. It's kind of an open secret at that point.
I was going to say, are people shocked? I mean, the public's probably a little bit surprised.
Yeah.
They've had their fill of James Bond movies by then, so they're familiar with the concept.
Yeah, I think
that in the British context.
Well, exactly, and I think there'd been sufficient rumours. I think there had been a couple of newspaper reports, the agency that must not be named type thing. So I don't think it was a complete surprise, and certainly people in the public service would have been pretty aware of it. But the reason Fraser undertakes to tell Parliament is because that's one of the recommendations of the First Hope Royal Commission in the 70s, which is a Royal Commission that Whitlam sets up, not so much just because of his run-in with ASIS, but because of a whole lot of issues with ASIO as well. The Whitlam government has a lot of difficulties with the intelligence services that he decides that there needs to be a
their
Royal
legacy
Commission.
issues from the 50s, do you think, in the end?
Well, they do go to this cultural identity of the agencies. I think Whitlam, when he comes to power, there is a lot of suspicion on behalf of the Labor Party of whether ASIO is really properly focusing its resources on the things that are really the great threats to Australia's security, because ASIO is, because of the Cold War, is very fixated on communism. But in the 1970s, you have the bombing of the Yugoslavian consulate here in Melbourne, and there's this sense that there might be foreign actors from the Yugoslav intelligence services also engaging in Australia, and the Labor Party feel that ASIO may have dropped the ball on this threat because of their kind of ideological obsession with communism, and that's when you get the Murphy raid. So Lionel Murphy, the Attorney General, famously, on his own volition, gathers up a whole bunch of Commonwealth police officers and raids the ASIO offices in Canberra and in Melbourne, because he believes that ASIO is not properly briefing him as the Attorney General, that they're withholding information. So this is the kind of great breakdown of the relationship between the Whitlam government and the intelligence services. So you have on the one hand, those crises of confidence I mentioned with ASIS, and then you have this crisis with ASIO. And this is what prompts Whitlam, before the dismissal, to make the decision to conduct a Royal Commission. And he appoints Robert Marsden Hope to undertake this Royal Commission into intelligence and security. And that Royal Commission is carried on through the Fraser government as well. And Fraser begins to implement the recommendations of the Royal Commission in the late 70s.
And of course, Whitlam's view of communism and communist powers, like China, was very different from his liberal predecessors. So his government takes quite a kind of dovish view of China. I mean, obviously visits China before he becomes Prime Minister, and then recognises PRC as China when he comes to power in 1972. So you've got a real change in Australia's strategic posture and engagement with what were, formerly considered the arch enemies of liberal democracies. So that would have been quite challenging for the security services to have a very different brief, very different direction. And, it can be, as we know, there can be a little bit of an episode of Yes Minister from time to time.
Well, and not just on China. I mean, also on Indonesia, right? I mean, Whitlam was really wanted to see a constructive and much more friendly relationship between Australia and Indonesia. So, throughout the kind of 1950s under Menzies, there was a perennial suspicion that, while Indonesia had this policy of non-alignment, that Indonesia could fall to communism or become aligned with the communists. And so Indonesia is a much bigger target for Australian intelligence during the 50s and the 60s. But Whitlam, he wants to see Australia have a much more constructive and I suppose equal relationship with its neighbours in Southeast Asia. And so he prioritises a better relationship with Indonesia, which is part of his reasoning about telling ASIS to get out of Timor, because this is one of the kind of the great controversies of Whitlam's government. I mean, he kind of makes the decision in a way, to put it kind of crudely, to kind of throw Timor independence under the bus in favour of a stronger relationship with Indonesia. So he does come to power at a time when there's, I guess, a few turning points in Australia's approach to the world, which I think you're right. There's the extent to which the intelligence services are a little slow to adapt and calibrate themselves to that.
Well, an absolutely fascinating discussion, and I am very much looking forward to you participating and presenting at our conference in November this year, where you'll talk more about this really important topic, and I hope we can get you on to talk about further research in the future too. So, thank you very much for joining me on Afternoon Light.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
The Afternoon Light podcast is brought to you by the Robert Menzies Institute at the University of Melbourne. You can find more about the Institute and our podcast at robertmenziesinstitute.org.au. We're also on Twitter, on Facebook and LinkedIn. We look forward to you joining our show next week. Thank you.